let me welcome you. I'm Charles Mayer, one of the long-standing members of this center, an occasional teacher of Italian history, and we're delighted, as you know, we're having this the first annual, we hope, Gaetano Salvemini Lecture in Italian History. This one coincides with what would be in 2 weeks the 90th anniversary of the March on Rome, which will be part of the subject of our lecture. We're not exactly celebrating that, obviously. We are taking note of that. 30 years ago, I helped organize a 60th anniversary colloquium on the anniversary of the March on Rome, which was a very good intellectual event. And we're delighted for this one to bring probably the leading historian of fascism working today, Emilio Gentile. He will be introduced later. I just want to say welcome. There will be introductory remarks. At the end, there will be also, I won't say a brindisi for the March on Rome, but there will be refreshments upstairs that you're all welcome to share. And so I think at this point, I would like just to say one word of thanks. First, to the Consul for his support and material support of this event and enthusiasm for it. And then to Renato Camuri, who's been a long time visitor and associate of this center, for having conceived this event. And then, of course, to those who will be participating. But I would like to ask the Consul if he would like to say a few words first. Giovanni Pastorelli.
Thank you, Professor Mayer. When you said enthusiasm, you were absolutely right. Because with that spirit, I started the cooperation between the Consulate and the Center for European Studies. And since I realized that there were few Italian scholars here, then I've approached Professor Mayer and the then director, Tricia Craig, to say how we can enhance Italian presence in the center and how can we discuss more about Italy in the center. That's why I'm particularly happy, and I would like to thank Professor Mayer to have been very much instrumental to bring this colloquium to life, and Renato Camurri, who has proposed this idea, because what we try to achieve is to start an annual series of colloquium about Italian history and culture. Every time selecting a topic of interest and maybe taking stock of an anniversary, like it was this case, the March on Rome. The center has graciously established also a section on its website regarding this annual Gaetano Salvemini colloquium. And that is very important and dear to me, and I would like to thank you very much, because the real objective is to talk more about Italian history and culture, sometimes on a different perspective, on a different note from what you read on the press. And I'm particularly grateful to Professor Gentile, that is one of the most prominent Italian historians who has accepted our invitation. I've heard a lot about him because my father is an historian as well, and actually he was a colleague of him in the same department of the same university. So I finally had the chance to meet him in person, and I would like to thank you really very much for accepting this invitation. I'm sure you will all enlighten us tonight. So without further ado, thank you all for being here. Your presence is a sign and is a further push that we need to continue this annual series. So without your participation, this thing could have not been possible. Grazie a tutti e ci vediamo più tardi.
Today is not the first time that I speak on Gaetano Salvemini at Harvard University, and yet for an Italian historian, approaching this personality is always an emotional and challenging endeavor. It has been a great honor to contribute to the realization of this colloquium. Many thanks to the center and to his new director, to the post-executive director, Tricia Craig, to Charles Mayer, as well as Consul Giuseppe Pastorelli for having believed in the idea, and I look forward to repeating this experience for many years to come. I remember that when I first came to this university years ago, I read everything Salvemini had written about his American experience very attentively. I have in mind recorded in Fuoriuscito, written between 1954 and 1956, published in unfaded work in 1960 and republished recently. I discovered that the description of the intimate world of university life at Harvard, including a widened library and the relationship between the teaching staff and students, were perfect. The only advice that I have failed to make my own is when Salvemini explains how a speaker should address an American audience. Always begin with a joke to capture the attention of your listeners. Obviously, there is no chance that I can convey a full biography in just a few minutes. This may be superfluous, but I should haste to say that we are talking about one of the most significant Italian political and cultural personalities of the 20th century. One of his first biographers, Massimo Salvadori, defined him as the greatest teacher of our contemporary society in the 20th century. And Salvadori added that while Salvemini was certainly not a great theoretician, he was no doubt the Italian intellectual who best challenged the 20th century totalitarian regimes from a political and intellectual standpoint. Indeed, Salvemini's speech made in Paris in 1943 at the Congrès International des Écrivains pour la Défense de la Culture was given in an atmosphere of a general embrasement between democratic and post-communist intellectuals, is a turning point in his political and intellectual biography. To the consternation of his audience, Salvemini did not hesitate to attack those men of culture who, in the name of common battle against fascism, kept quiet on the totalitarian nature of Stalin's regime. Many prestigious institutions and research organizations have been named after Salvemini. He is constantly at the center of attention in Italian historiography, and his figure is revised frequently, including recent publications dedicated to his socialist period, for instance. The 50th anniversary of his passing in 2007 was commemorated here at Harvard, among other places, thanks to the effort spearheaded by Professor Lino Pertile. This coincided with a renewed interest in Salvemini and his intellectual journey, where even his contribution as a political thinker is being revised, as well we'll see shortly. It is no accident that this has happened in a country such as Italy, that has undergone a profound political, institutional, and moral crisis. Returning to the country's great figures of the past is to be expected. However, from a purely cultural point of view, we are tempted to interpret this rediscovery as an attempt to reclaim what a contemporary European American analytical philosopher called strong thought. This thought is based on new realism, following decades during which it was said that there are no facts but only interpretations, and there was no difference between reality and fiction. Indeed, Salvemini was the master of realism and detested grand schemes based on interpretation, just as he detested all types of ideological barriers. What is appreciated today in Salvemini is not so much his uncompromising anti-fascism, but above all, his political transformation. We are referring to the fact that following a long period of militance in the ranks of the Socialist Party that ended in 1911, Salvemini took other paths. Between 1943 and the last year of his life, He returned to Italy in 1949, where he died in 1957. He became the critical conscience of Italian politics. Suffice it to think of his articles published in Mario Pannunzio's review Il Mondo, which targeted to the political parties that had monopolized the Italian political scene since the fall of fascism, the Christian Democratic Party and the Communist Party. And Salvemini spent his remaining energy on the dream of creating a third liberal democratic force. In my opinion, the American years are critical to understand the metamorphosis of Salvemini's intellectual profile. When we speak of Gaetano Salvemini's American period, we are essentially referring to the period when he taught at Harvard, that began with the fall term of 1933 and ended with the spring term of 1948. His presence at Harvard left behind many traces, which would be worth mentioning if only we had more time. Allow me to mention his library, which he donated to Widener as a token of gratitude for the university where, he claimed, he spends the best year of his life, a life marked by much suffering and difficulties resulting from fascist persecutions. Salvemini's library is now an integral part of the body of Italian works in the Widener Library, and it constitutes a legacy of enormous wealth for scholars who wish to study Italian history from the late 18th to the 20th centuries. We could also speak about Salvemini's legacy as a teacher, with his courses on the Renaissance, the Risorgimento, and Italian diplomatic history. This Italian historian succeeded in renewing interest for Italian history. Because of Salvemini's prestige, during those years, Harvard became one of the most important centers for the study of Italian history and culture. Some of his former students has expressed engaging thoughts on Salvemini as a teacher, and have gone on to have a brilliant academic careers of their own as historians, such as Harry Stuart Hughes, who had taught here at Harvard, Norman Cogan, and William Salomone. Getting back to Salvemini's relationship with the United States, we should point out that his contact with the American world began long before his appointment at Harvard. Began with, I want to remember, an inheritance left by the American actress Ruth Draper, who was Laura De Bosi's partner. In 1927, Salvemini conducted a speaking tour in various United States cities. This was followed in 1928, 1930, and 1932, with a first visiting professorships at the New School for Social Research in New York, Harvard, and Yale. Salvemini's American period is the least studied in his intellectual narrative. The explanation for this lacuna is in large part attributable to a stereotyped image coined by one of his students, Enzo Tagliacozzo, who has written several articles on Salvemini's Harvard years. Tagliacozzo's writing describes Salvemini as a sort of medieval monk who looked himself up his study at Widener or in his mega room at Leverett House, buried by papers and books. The fact that this image took hold is confirmed by the word of a great historian, John Diggins, who wrote an important volume in 1972, Mussolini and Fascism, The View from America, in which he paints Salvemini in much the same light. Today, we view this image are completely passé. Despite his middle age, Salvemini quickly adapted to his new surroundings. Contrary to how he has been described, Salvemini didn't live like a voluntary recluse at all. He surrounded himself with a circle of Italian-American leaders, New Deal liberals, and public figures such as Walter Lippmann, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., Felix Frankfurter, as well as many Harvard historians, such as William Langer, professor of European history and the president of the American Historical Association, and Samuel Eliot Morrison, professor of American history. We could also emphasize how Salvemini's American phase was dedicated to intensive research activity, especially on fascism, but in the interest of time, we will not quote the title of his works. His title-speaking engagements had him crisscross the US on a personal crusade against the fascist regime. To fully grasp the significance of Salvemini's intellectual metamorphosis, his experience must be weaved in the broader narrative of a whole generation of European intellectuals and scientists who were forced to flee the whole continent between the two wars. There were two fields of social science research that were fueled by refugee scholars, which had an impact on Salvemini's works. The first are works on historical methodology that are drawn from a cycle of lessons held in Chicago in 1938 and later published with the emblematic title Historia and the Scientist by Harvard University Press in 1939. With this contribution, Salvemini tackled a central theme in American historiography in the 30s, the so-called noble dream on the objective of historical research. The title comes from a very interesting book of Peter Novick, The Noble Dream, the objectivity question of the American historical profession. And there was a theme written about other great European historians in the United States, such as Arthur Rosenberg and Ernest Kantorowicz. The second field of research was his reflections on the crisis of democracy, to which Salvemini dedicated several works and conferences between 1934 and 1940, and have recently been published in Italian. Some of these, such as Democracy and Dictatorship in 1934 and Democracy Reconsidered, reveal an historian capable of arguing theories formulated by scholars such as Ostrogowski, Weber, Consul, and Schumpeter, which one he was closest on a theoretical point of view. Salvemini's observation of American political life contributed to a redefinition of the rules of the concept of democracy. Italian scholars of political sciences, such as Pierpaolo Portinaro, have stressed the great influence of Salvemini had on successive elaboration by Norberto Bobbio and Giovanni Sartori, the two most famous Italian political scientists. So, this was the Harvard Salvemini, a free man who never bent to any servitude imposed by politics and history, an anti-conformist intellectual, open to questioning the new American society that had taken him in, a refugee who transformed his traumatic experience into an opportunity to enrich his baggage of knowledge. Thank you.
Thanks, Renato. Yes, I'm sorry to have missed him when he was here. He sort of brought together the pre-World War I period to the post-World War II period. Stuart Hughes knew him well. Stuart was a teacher of mine, and Patrice Iganez, who is our French historian. I will introduce, I'd like to say a few words about our major speaker, Emilio Gentile. Not much. He's represented in our Widener catalog with 46 titles. So productivity is certain, and he is immensely productive in Italian history. And he was a student of Renzo De Felice, who was the leading biographer of Mussolini, obviously many years, died relatively young. Emilio is, in a sense, taken the mantle of De Felice, and he's best known, I mean, he's published the book Il culto dell'Itorio, la sacralizzazione della politica nell'Italia fascista, religione della politica, a lot on fascism. I bought the most recent one, I think, Roma di Pietra, when I was in Rome, about the monuments and the remaking of Rome in the fascist ventennio. He's written on the United States. He was also close with George Mossy, who from whom the notions of political religion and sacralization and involvement of the masses. Welcome, Spencer. So I hope you found a parking space. No, okay. It's okay. You're here for the main act and what you have to cover. That's great. So Spencer Di Scala, our colleague from UMass Boston, anyway, the list goes on. I'm sure it hasn't ended yet. Generally, he is known as, I think his major imprint has been to take the ritualistic aspects of fascism seriously, to see them as crucial in what this movement was about. And it's a great privilege to welcome him here. I think he will speak today about another aspect of the seriousness of fascism. There will be three of us who will briefly respond to this talk and discuss it. And so, without further ado, though, let me ask Emilio to take the floor, and we look forward to your lecture.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I want to thank the Consul who permitted me to come here, the Center for European Studies to invite me, Professor Charles Meyer, Professor Camurri, who dared to propose me as the first speaker in the first annual Salvemini Colloquium. Of course, it's an honor to have been chosen as the opening speaker for the Salvemini Colloquium here at Harvard. And that's why I feel the responsibility that comes with it. I hope to fulfill the task at hand in the best possible way, but I'm sure that on the eve of the Year of the Italian Culture, 2013, this will be a good appetizer. And I think that the first annual Salvemini Colloquium will become an institution, so that I could say to my descendants in the future, I'm proud to have been there at the beginning and to have a part in it as the speaker. The choice of the subject came me both from the name of Gaetano Salvemini, an anti-fascist and historian specialized in fascism, and from the first Salvemini Colloquium coinciding with the 19th anniversary of the March on Rome. Obviously, as Charles Meyer said, this is not an anniversary to celebrate, but it's worth commenting on it with a new reflection on its significance for the history of Italy. 17 years after the March on Rome, November 17, 1939, the American Philosophical Society organized in Philadelphia the first colloquium on the totalitarian state. The participants were outstanding scholars of politics, political science, economics, education, philosophy, and also historians as Hans Kohn and Carlton Hayes. However, none of them mentioned the origins of the concept of totalitarianism and its relation with the March on Rome. And all of them ignored the Italian anti-fascists who first coined the word and used the concept. Tonight, I will talk about those Italian anti-fascists who immediately understood that the March on Rome was the beginning of a new regime. And they defined this new regime as totalitarian. They coined the word. 19 years ago, you see Mussolini marching on Rome. A sharp German diplomat, Count Harry Kessler, wrote in his diary on October 29th, in Italy, the fascists have attained power through a coup d'etat. If they retain it, then this is a historic event which can have unforeseeable consequences, not only for Italy, but the whole of Europe. It may be the first step in the successful advance of a counter-revolution. In a certain sense, Mussolini's coup d'etat is comparable, in the opposite direction, of course, to Lenin's October 17. Perhaps it will usher in a period of a fresh European disorder and wars. And the following day, the Count added, Mussolini has been appointed Prime Minister by the King of Italy. This may turn out to be a black day for Italy and for Europe. In the same day, American journalist Carlton Beals, who was in Rome during the fascist uprising, wrote in his diary, Mussolini has come to Rome. By grace of the king and destiny and his own genius, minister of the realm. In all but name, dictator of Italy. Whatever enlightened benefits the new regime may bring to Italy, constitutionalism, liberty in Italy has turned up its toes. The significant thing, a new era has begun in Italy, as it began in Rome with the dictatorship of Sulla. The events of these last few days are part of a European tendency that began with the Great War, embraced the Russian Revolution, and may not end in our generation. In hindsight, we realize how accurate those forecasts were. In 1920s and 1930s, fascism actually gave impulse to the birth of extreme right-wing movements and regime throughout Europe, most of all to National Socialism. It is therefore safe to say that the March on Rome was at the origin of the mortal challenge posed by European fascism to liberal and democratic civilization. The history of March on Rome and its consequences are well known, but its interpretation is still controversial among historians, as much as it was among contemporaries. Most anti-fascists first commented on the fascist uprising with sarcasm. On November 2nd, Piero Gobetti, 21 years old, a young revolutionary liberal intellectual and intransigent anti-fascist in the origin, in his review, La Rivoluzione Liberale, defined Mussolini's rise to power as student-like parenthesis. Not even Gaetano Salvemini took the March on Rome seriously. On January the 9th, 1923, he wrote in his diary that the fascist revolution was a carnival. And yet, after almost 2 decades of fascist rule, in the lectures on fascism he held here at Harvard, Salvemini defined the March on Rome a comic opera. The sarcastic underestimation is still present in current historiography. As recently as 2010, the historian Donald Sassoon wrote that the March on Rome had been little more than a paltry gathering of useful idiots. But after having ridiculed the March on Rome, it is unexplained how one of the great tragedies of the 20th century emerged from a comic opera. The trivialization of March on Rome has seriously affected the understanding of the origins and the nature of the fascist regime. There are historians who still believe that the fascism reached power without no government program or ideas for a new regime. In 1966, the renowned historian Renzo De Felice said that Mussolini, after the March on Rome, did not have a clear authoritarian will, but that he only wanted to grant more strength to the executive branch of the government without even questioning the parliamentary system. More recently, historian Roberto Vivarelli repeated that in its first year of government, fascism remained a nebula. Hence, according to these historians, the single-party regime introduced into Italy by fascism was the product of unforeseen circumstances and events, and most of all, was a consequence of the weakness of its opponents. In reality, even if fascism did not have a clear government program, it did have its own ideas about the kind of state it wanted to build, an anti-democratic state that would not grant any more political and civil rights. And this idea was expressed openly many times by Mussolini and the fascist press on the eve of March on Rome. And since the first months following their rise to power, Mussolini and the fascist party actively implemented their idea of the anti-democratic regime. First and foremost, by maintaining the armed militia in order to terrorize all those who did not accept fascism or did not consider its rise to power, as Salvemini did, an irrevocable event. Only a few anti-fascists clearly realized this right away. They understood that the March on Rome was not comic opera, but rather the beginning of a tragedy, because once in power, fascism, due to its very nature of a militia party, was inevitably going to kill democracy. The historical relevance of their reflections lies in the fact that they were formulated in the year 1923. That means 2 years earlier than the official establishment of the single-party regime. Had most anti-fascists understood the true nature of fascism the same way, maybe they could have acted more promptly to oppose it and perhaps even to defeat it. Moreover, I think that their reflections are still today important not only for the understanding of the historical significance of March on Rome, but also for a reappraisal of the concept of totalitarianism, starting from its original historical meaning, so as to free it from the uses and abuses of abstract speculation with no roots in history. 19 years ago, exactly in the afternoon of October 16th, Benito Mussolini called a meeting in Milan. The participants included the secretary of the fascist party, Michele Bianchi, the three commanders of the fascist quadrumvirate, De Bono, De Vecchi, Italo Balbo, and 2 retired generals. Mussolini announced his decision to march on Rome to take over power. But his plan was to demand a new government headed by an old liberal prime minister with only 5 fascist ministers. Mussolini did the claim to be the new prime minister. Preparation for the March on Rome continued in the 2 following weeks, but until October 26th, no fascist leader, not even Mussolini, had thought that the Duce of fascism would become the new prime minister, with the exception of Michele Bianchi, the secretary of the fascist party. While Mussolini was still inclined to follow the parliamentary way to power, Bianchi wanted an insurrection to force the liberal ruling class to hand over power to fascism. And Bianchi himself claimed credit for his primary role in a letter to Mussolini dated June the 10th, 1924, the day when Matteotti was murdered. Remember, Duce, that the March on Rome would not have been possible if in August 1922 fascism did not suppress the Legaricanian strike, imposing as per my initiative, only because of my initiative against you scolding me for my impulsive action, the 48-hour ultimatum, which broke the last attempt by the anti-fascist organization to stop fascism. Turati, the reformist leader, defined the intervention, squad intervention against the general strike, the socialist caporetto. Remember, Duce, that at the cost of being labeled as crazy by the wise men who pontificated about politics in Rome on the eve of the march, I was the first on October 26th to launch the idea of a Mussolini's government. It is well known that the March on Rome, in the sense of a takeover of the capital by the fascist militia, never happened. Rome was guarded by 20,000 armed soldiers, while the fascist legions camped outside the city on the morning of October 28th amounted maybe at 10,000 poorly armed. The army could have easily crushed the fascist insurrection, but the king refused to sign the declaration of a martial law. However, even if a real march on the capital never occurred, we must remember that an uprising actually exploded in many cities of northern and central Italy without, in most cases, encountering any resistance from the army or the local police forces. The insurrection confused the government leaders and intimidated the king, who thought he could avoid a civil war and save the dynasty by refusing to declare the martial law. It is a common saying that fascism rose to power thanks to a compromise. In truth, Bianchi and Mussolini obtained the appointment of the Duce as prime minister only by using the insurrection as a blackmail. Only in this way could Bianchi and Mussolini succeed in getting the leader of an armed party, totally illegal, according to the Italian code, penal code, to be named as prime minister of a parliamentary government. The king would have, if the king, the capitalist, the army, the Pope, would have preferred a government headed by a former prime minister with the participation of some fascist representative. In the end, the liberal elite, the capitalist, the king, the army gave in to the fascist demands under the threat of armed insurrection, but also hoping to coop the fascist party into the liberal institutions. Even if there was a compromise, it was totally to the advantage of fascism, which was given the reins of government after violently demolishing the prestige and the authority of a liberal state. In exchange, fascism conceded a declaration of loyalty to the monarchy. And the vague promises of the restoration of law and order in compliance with the constitution. The fascist legions entered Rome peacefully. You see, they entered peacefully with a triumphal parade. The young American ambassador in Rome, Richard Wishburne Child, born in Worcester, Massachusetts, wrote his father, we are having a fine young revolution here. No danger. Plenty of enthusiasm and color. We all enjoy it. And on November 4th, he informed his government, no revolution has moved quicker or achieved success more easily. Conservative Western government gave fascism credit for saving Italy from Bolshevism and saluted Mussolini's government for restoring order. On November 11th, Salvemini wrote from Paris, here everybody's on cloud 9 because they all believe fascism defeated Bolshevism. In truth, when fascism ascended to power, there was no Bolshevism to defeat. The threat of a Bolshevik revolution in Italy and in the rest of Europe had faded since 1920. In July 1921, Mussolini himself said that those who still spoke of a Bolshevik danger in Italy were detached from reality. Nevertheless, fascists justified the armed violence of its squads, of squadrismo, as a reaction to Bolshevik violence during the so-called Red Biennium, 1919-1920. In reality, statistics show that the political crimes committed in Italy during the Red Biennium were fewer than those perpetrated during the Black Biennium in 1921, 1922, and after the March on Rome. According to statistics issued by the fascist government, between 1918 and 1923, a total of 428 fascists were killed, while data gathered by Salvemini sets the victims of fascist violence at about 3,000. Mussolini formed a government dominated by fascists with the participation of other parties, but it was not a coalition government, as many historians claim, because ministers were not chosen by the parties, but by Mussolini himself directly. And Mussolini fired them when their parties criticized fascism. On November 16th, Mussolini gave a contemptuous inaugural speech to the Chamber of Deputies. I could have transformed this grey and gloomy chamber into a bivouac for my platoons. I could have locked up the parliament and formed an exclusive fascist government. I could have, but at least for now, I have not. And yet, this outraged Chamber of Deputies still cast a favorable confidence vote in the hope that channeling fascism into the constitutional mainstream. The brutal parliamentary speech was not only unusual, the only unusual aspect of Mussolini's in his inaugural speech. The personality of Mussolini was just as odd compared to his predecessors. These are not images to distract you from the speech, but to give more intense visual sense of what was the change in Italy, even in kind of anthropologic aspect of the leaders of Italy. This is Mussolini, official picture as head of the government. How were look alike? All his predecessors, old men like Sonnino, serious men like Giolitti, severe men like Salandra, a little bit ambitious men like Nitti, and the last one, head of a government of a liberal state in Italy, Facta, famous for the moustache. And was Mussolini. At 39 years of age, Mussolini was the youngest head of government in the history of Italy. He had no previous experience in government or in public administration, no academic qualification, and had been a member of the parliament for only 16 months. Not to mention his political past as a vagabond. Here, this is a picture taken by the police, Swiss police, when Mussolini was a vagabond in Switzerland. Or his past as a ferocious international revolutionary socialist. But there is another novelty. This young head of the state, of the government, with this very strange past, was even immediately adored as a kind of charismatic leader with a kind of divine mission. This is a picture, a postcard of 1923. There was not yet the organization of the consensus. And nevertheless, spontaneously Mussolini was compared to the ancient Romans. With the exception, and the other important fact, that no other government in Europe, not even in the Hungary, the Admiral Orfi, had under its direct control a personal private militia. The fascist squads, that means the most illegal band of killers, was transformed in the official militia for the national security. But only the fascists could be enrolled in it. With the exception of the Soviet Russia, in 1923, there was no government in Europe comparable to the fascist one. In no other country, except for Russia, did an armed party claim the irrevocable monopoly of political power. And finally, in no other country, not even in Soviet Russia, in 1923, was the head of the government celebrated as a charismatic leader invested with some sort of divine mission. 90 years ago, few understood that the advent of fascism was in fact the end of the liberal state in Italy. As young socialist Piero Nenni pointed out, when the March on Rome happened, everybody in Italy agreed not to take fascism seriously. On October 1927, that means on the eve of the March on Rome, the communist Gramsci's newspaper Ordine Nuovo defined the gathering of 4,000 fascists in Naples, when Mussolini decided the beginning of the insurrection, the end of the farce. According to Gramsci, fascism, on the eve of the March on Rome, was showing evident symptoms of disgregation. As a consequence of the trivialization of the March on Rome in the following months, most anti-fascists continue to believe that fascism would fail because it was deficient in ideology, social force, and the government program. On November 27th, Filippo Turati, leader of the Socialist Party, reformist, wrote, "The fascist wave will pass. It is a crumbling team." And in 1923, many anti-fascists shared this prevision. In May 1923, Salvemini still expected an imminent end to fascism. On May 2nd, he wrote, "Last November, I was convinced that the Mussolini ministry would not have lasted 6 months. 6 months have passed and is still standing. Thus, I was wrong. However, the whole picture seems to be pointing to a rapid debacle. I am no longer going to make chronologic prophecies, but it seems evident to me that their disaster is progressing in a uniformly accelerated motion." And Anna Kulishov, Turati's partner in the same period, wrote, "Fascism debacle so rapid and precipitant makes us fear the risk that the avalanche of its fall would overwhelm men and parties who fight against this prankish dictatorship." Only the few anti-fascists who took the March on Rome seriously realized immediately the dictatorial will of the fascist rule. Among them, there was Luigi Salvatorelli, editorial writer of the anti-fascist newspaper La Stampa, owned by the capitalist Agnelli, the owners of the Fiat. A year before the March on Rome, Salvatorelli had labeled fascism as a reactionary Bolshevism, a danger today infinitely more real than the communist Bolshevism. On December 21st, 1922, Salvatorelli stated, criticizing all the people hoping to channel fascism in the liberal institution, "We said from the beginning that the March on Rome was not a contingent revolutionary episode, but a real revolution leading to dictatorship." And in April 1923, Salvatorelli added, "Fascism wants the single-party system, in other words, the suppression of all parties and the end of political life as we know it, at least as we have known it here in Europe for the last 100 years." Just like Salvatorelli, liberal leader Giovanni Amendola understood fascist dictatorial will before the March on Rome. On October 13, 1922, Amendola denounced the incompatibility between the liberal democratic and the fascist idea of the state. The fascist state is a mystical one, while the liberal state is a rational one. The democratic state, explained Amendola, was founded on rational principles that recognized the freedom and the equality of all citizens, while fascists conceived of the state as a dominion of a minority. Amendola coined the term totalitarian. In May 1923, commenting on the electoral reform adopted by fascists to win all local elections, Amendola defined it as a totalitarian system. The fascist party had almost obtained the total votes because of the use of the prefect and so on. In this way, Amendola noted that the fascist totalitarian system had produced the kingdom of disorder and prevarication in the life of our cities and towns, where the fascists act as a minority of privileged individuals who hold the exclusive right to rule over the rest of the population. Fascists constitute a dominant caste, impenetrable and implacable, who treats the population as mass of a servant. And on June 3rd, 1923, Amendola added, "The leader of this caste acted as a prophet of God who came to earth to correct, punish, and amend a degenerated population with the collaboration of a privileged minority of a superior rank and breed." Even the Catholic, the fascist Catholic were alarmed immediately by the presence of fascism. And while the Vatican began negotiations with Mussolini, who declared to be profoundly religious and a sincere Catholic, the priest Luigi Sturzo, founder and secretary of the Catholic Popular Party, was clear and decisive in condemning fascism as an anti-Christian movement because it sacralized the state and the nation. In October 1923, Sturzo warned, "The most serious menace is fascist claim to monopolize the education through Balil organization and the school, giving the priest the sole task of supporting, through the Catholic tradition, the sacralization of the nation and fascism itself." And at the end of 1923, Sturzo wrote that the fascists aimed at a totalitarian transformation of any and every moral, cultural, political, religious institution according to its own principle. Fascism, added Sturzo, used force to impose this totalitarian and dominating tendency with the constant elimination of all parties from local administration, suppressing cooperatives and labor unions, forcing people to enroll in the party, inducing prefects to comply, and let fascists take over all local organs and bodies of the administrative, economic, and technical life of the community. The same bottom line was drawn at the end of 1923. I stress 1923. No one was thinking about the totalitarian regime, single-party regime. Matteotti, in a book entitled 1 Year of Fascist Domination, by using a detailed documentation, he confirmed what our anti-fascists who defined the fascist rule as totalitarian had already denounced. Matteotti described a state subordinated to the party, where fascists enjoy a second and more important kind of Italian citizenship, without which civil rights and freedom of vote, residence, circulation, gathering, work, speech, and even thought are not granted. On October 1923, Gobetti also drew a pessimistic picture. In a year of a government, Mussolini broke all resistance, forced all men to bend, to renounce their dignity. He reduced liberals, Democrats, and members of the Catholic Party to slaves. For this reason, the young liberal revolutionary did not believe in the imminent failure of fascism. There is a fact, above all facts: the regime is consolidating, triumphing over all oppositions, mocking all adversaries. Equally pessimistic was Amendola commenting the first anniversary of the March on Rome. What was the first anniversary of March on Rome? You just try to imagine President Obama, after 1 year in power, decided to issue a special stamp celebrating his advent to power. Decided to coin a special golden coin to celebrate his first year of power, or organized a parade of 400 planes extolling the glory of fascism and Mussolini. Do you imagine if it was at the time already, yet, the prime minister of a parliamentary government, but never in the history of a parliamentary governments, 1 year only, not even Berlusconi had to do that. 1 year only was celebrated as the beginning of a new era. The beginning of a new era. Commenting on the celebration, and you see the prime minister of a liberal state marching in the uniform of a private militia. Commenting on the celebration, Amendola observed that for future historians, the basic feature of fascism would be the totalitarian spirit, which does not allow the future to have any dawns that are not saluted with the Roman gesture, just like it does not allow the present to nurture souls that are not yet bent into believing the fascist creed. This peculiar war of religion that for over a year has raged in Italy denies the right to have your own conscience and taints the future by putting a dark mortgage on it. Moving to the conclusion, I have to cut something, but perhaps you will read more in my next book. So it's I said at the beginning that the importance of the early reflections lies in not only in their realistic vision, but also in their usefulness in terms of reappraisal of the concept of totalitarianism. Today, there are scholars who not only deny fascist totalitarianism, but also the fact that any political reality can be defined as totalitarian. Recently, one Italian scholar stated, totalitarianism does not exist, it is just a word. And so some scholars go so far as to call for banning the use of the term totalitarianism in scientific discourse. We would need a whole other lecture, but I conclude with this one at least, to demonstrate the absurdity of this kind of ostracism. Here, we have only to consider that the denial of totalitarianism would transform Salvemini, Salvatorelli, Amendola, Sturzo, Matteotti, Gobetti, those men of high intellect, as well as great dignity and courage, would transform them in victims of their own invention, like the children of the Darling family believing in the existence of Peter Pan and his Neverland. But is it possible to say that the political reality these anti-fascists observed in Italy after the March on Rome, and they defined as totalitarian, did not exist? We must bear in mind that when they spoke of totalitarianism, they did not refer to the fascist ideology, which they considered inconsistent, but rather to its action, its actual rule. For them, totalitarianism meant the persecution of anti-fascists as internal enemies of the nation, the monopoly of politics and power, the dualism and overlapping of government and party organization. used to submit the state to the party, the creation of a privileged minority who dominated the masses, the sacralization of the nation and the state is absolute and indisputable entities, the cult of the duce. All these things, facts, not ideology, were happening in Italy in 1923. To say that in order to, it's a commonplace to say that in order to fully comprehend the historical phenomenon, we need the detachment of one or more generations. But these anti-fascists, who in 1923 interpreted fascism as totalitarianism, understood the significance of a march on Rome better than many scholars are able to do today. This extraordinary capacity of realistic prevision were inspired by their respect of civil and political liberties, founded on a very strong sense of human dignity. They were not prophets, but some of them became martyrs. When these anti-fascists spoke of totalitarianism, they were describing their persecutor and slayer. Matteotti was murdered in 1924 by an anti-fascist gang. In the same year, Sturzo was forced into exile, where Ferrari, another young Catholic anti-fascist, joined him in 1925 to avoid the risk of being murdered. Also, Salvemini went into exile after death threats he received by the Florentine squadristi. Amendola and Gobetti were repeatedly assaulted by the fascist squads, and the wounds they suffered were among the causes of their death in France in 1926. On November 1939, at the first symposium on the totalitarian state, historian Carlton Ice warned, "The dictatorial totalitarianism of today is a reaction, nay more, a revolt against the whole historic civilization of the West." That revolt, as we know, ultimately resulted in World War II. But at the end of the day, even though highly defective in its practical implementation, democracy has survived the challenge of totalitarianism. Even so, I think it could still be useful today in studying totalitarianism and in reflecting on the controversies the term has generated, to think about the historical reality of its origins and its consequences on Italian and European history. Mason, you know him of course, a Greek philosopher and one of the 7 sages, almost unknown because we have only one sentence by him. And this sentence is a proof that is the widest of all the sages, because the oracle of Delphi was asked, who is the wisest of the 7 sages? Of course, Mason, because Mason used to say, we should not investigate facts by the light of arguments, but arguments by the light of facts. For the facts were not put together to fit the arguments, but the arguments to fit the facts. In 1939, in Philadelphia, the proceedings of the American Philosophical Society on totalitarianism were held, I quote, for promoting useful knowledge. I hope that I was trying to do with you tonight. Thank you.
That was a great talk, Emilio, as always. In Arrigo Boito's opera Mefistofele, the devil appears to Faust, who asks his name. Mephistopheles says that the question is silly, but Faust insists, in nome a tal virtù che rivela l'essenza. In plain English, the name reveals the essence of the thing. In his answer, Mephistopheles doesn't say, my name is Mephistopheles, otherwise known as the devil, which would have made everything crystal clear in a heartbeat, but instead gives a complex answer that cannot be characterized as a soundbite. In his paper on totalitarianism, Emilio also paints an intricate picture because what he is describing is a complex, not a simplistic phenomenon, as most people want it to be. As far as I am concerned, he does an excellent job because no doubt remains, at least in my mind, about the origins of the word totalitarian or the impact of this phenomenon. What I find particularly rich about Emilio's paper is that it goes beyond the problems created by the issue of totalitarianism and raises a host of implications about the historical profession and its possible distortions. These have had an effect not only on historical interpretations, but also on contemporary society, as he points out. Emilio emphasizes how observers at the time misinterpreted the March on Rome, viewing it as inconsequential and an opera buffa. Still unexplained, he asks, is how an opera buffa touched off one of the greatest tragedies of the 20th century. Unfortunately, many historians still tend to denigrate the significance of the March on Rome 90 years later in similar terms. While Hitler is seen as a monster, Mussolini is still considered pretty much innocuous by many people, a clown, if not by some historians, in popular mythology. Still unexplained is how this ineffective buffoon managed to take over a country of sophisticated politicians, not to say intellectuals, and impose a regime such as the one that Emilio has described, and which was greatly admired and considered a model, not only in the remote countries of Eastern Europe, but among significant sectors in the democracies of Western Europe and America. Worse still, the challenge that Mussolini threw down to liberal democracy probably would have been successful in Europe had it not been for the military intervention of the United States in World War II. To keep misunderstanding fascism exposes us all to a revival of some unforeseen mutation of the movement, especially when we consider that the fascist phenomenon is multifaceted and adaptable to different conditions and contexts. In a basso ostinato heard throughout his paper, Emilio has shown how historians have been reluctant to change their interpretation, that he is here making a case for the concept of totalitarianism 90 years after Mussolini's rise to power, and the opposition he has faced over the years speaks volumes. This tendency to keep repeating what I would call standard interpretations has wide implications. Not only is there a danger that the significance of a movement or events may be distorted, but in order to be consistent, other history and contemporary affairs must be warped as well. Thus, many historians continue to see Italian fascism as not serious, unlike German Nazism, which was important. While this argument may be seen as positive in a sense, we should think about its implications. It seems true that fascism did not make as many inroads in Italian society as Nazism did in German, although Emilio might disagree with me on some of these points. But this reality means, again, that Italians are not serious, inefficient, as not having been able to build a state come si deve after the Risorgimento. How many times have we heard the old saw that Hitler took only a few months to set up a dictatorship, while it took Mussolini years to do the same thing? I know that Emilio has continually argued against this absurdity by pointing out that Italian fascism began in 1919 and by 1922 was in power, while the Nazi Party was founded in 1920 but took until 1933 to come to power. I'm sorry to say, Emilio, that in general your explanation has fallen on deaf ears. To the argument that Mussolini did not establish a dictatorship until 1925-26, Emilio's paper demonstrates that there was a dictatorship in Italy already in October 1922, and that is why the anti-fascist writers he mentioned coined the term totalitarian in 1923. Unfortunately, many intellectuals did not perceive the fact then, and many still do not now. It gets worse. Historians like to find deep roots to explain phenomena. Therefore, in a sort of Italian Sonderweg, some have discovered character flaws in Italians that go back to the Roman Empire, eventually producing fascism with the March on Rome on October 28, 1922. The Germans have suffered a similar fate, but at least the Kaiser's Second Reich is considered something serious, to be analyzed in an equally serious manner. Not like Italy, where all kinds of superficial statements are fair game, especially among general historians who do not know the country and breathe in the silly atmosphere of the historiography on Italy. This brings us to the Italian liberal democratic state, which could do nothing right. Emilio has cited Gaetano Salvemini, although I think this is one of the parts you cut out of your paper. So in a sense, it's not fair, but I'll cite what I'll cite his citation of Salvemini. Emilio cited Salvemini, who said that the liberal state was nothing more than a bunch of dictators who preceded the Duce. Yet the same liberal state gave him a good education, and none of those dictators forced him into exile when he said and wrote a lot of nasty things about them. As a medievalist, Salvemini has a great reputation. I am unsure about his worth as a historian of Italian liberal democracy. However, in his famous introductory essay to a book written by A. William Salomone, at least he had the decency to consider whether or not he had made a mistake. Salomone correctly saw the liberal period, despite all its flaws, as building, quote, Italian democracy in the making. And Salvemini agreed with the newly minted PhD. In other words, heavily influenced by misinterpretations of fascism, modern Italian history is seen as a series of failures, or, alla Gramsci, failed revolutions. Italy could not have had a real parliamentary regime because Mussolini came to power. And Mussolini came to power because Italy did not have a real parliamentary regime. At most, there must have been a decay of the liberal regime, as an old teacher of mine kindly expressed it. It is taken for granted by historians that the liberal state was weak and decayed, but could it not have been murdered instead by the after effects of World War I and by the maltreatment of its allies after that conflict? Because of the Vittoria Mutilata slogan of that slogan, actually invented by D'Annunzio, and we will celebrate his 200th anniversary of his birth next year. Because of the Vittoria Mutilata and its exploitation by nationalists at the time, the idea of fascism's rise being aided, and even in the slightest degree aided by the obtuseness of the Allies at Versailles, is anathema to historians. But at the same time, the Versailles Treaty is automatically quoted as a major cause of Hitler's rise. While fascism conquered the government, it made fewer inroads in society than the corresponding movement in Germany, as I have already stated. To take two examples, as Emilio pointed out in a paper he delivered in Boston a number of years ago, you see I remember your papers, as Mussolini became more fascist in his later years in power, the more Italian society resisted him. Also, there was no final solution in Italy. Rather, the dominant theme is resistance to Nazi attempts to slaughter Jews. The credit for this is generally given to Italiani brava gente, but this is an unexplainable concept. Can't we give the liberal tradition some credit? Emilio has given us many examples of liberal intellectuals who, from the beginning, correctly interpreted the rise of fascism in Italy as a new force that would challenge liberal democracy on the Italian as well as on the world stage. Thinkers such as Luigi Salvatorelli and Giovanni Amendola, unfortunately, as well as some of the others, in fact, most of the others that he mentioned, are all but forgotten now. If I would mention them in a class, even in an advanced class in 20th century Europe, my students will look at me with blank stares and accuse me of an Italocentric focus. However, those thinkers had the acumen that many of their contemporaries and successors lacked. We must remember that they grew up, were educated, and flourished in the Italian liberal state, the same one that has been defamed not only by the fascists who led the way, but also by many writers, non-fascist, anti-fascist, who followed them. I think that going beyond Emilio's paper, it is time to take a new look, not only at the observers that Emilio cited, but also at the milieu that fostered them and fostered their opposition to fascism. Thank you.
I will speak from notes because although I read the paper, I was not exactly sure in what version it would finally appear. I'm immensely grateful for this paper, because it does contest the image that most Americans and many Europeans have had of fascism as precisely as Spencer Discala said, of a sort of opera buffa interlude. We owe this in part in America to Luigi Barzini's popularization of this, and we owe it in part to the fact that we have been, looking at the clownishness in part of the last government. Making elisions. It's hard to remember how brutal and how serious this was. But these are brave people. Amendola was virtually beaten to death and died afterward. Gobetti was beaten. Their thoughts were immensely lucid. This was a very serious dictatorship, and it behooves us on the 90th anniversary to remember that. When I was studying beginning my studies of Italian history in the early 60s, mid-60s, the fashion was, in fact, to diminish the achievement of the liberal state, as you said. It didn't penetrate society. Italy was run by patronage in the South, by party clientelism. It had never developed civically. It was, in a sense, Jersey City written large. And it's, I think we are, maybe it's an effect of growing older, but I think we realize now that, in fact, this state was an achievement for a country sutured together out of many disparate parts, kingdoms, with a rather narrow political class, and that we absorbed Gramsci in our youth. It's not a sufficient analysis of what was achieved, and in some ways we turn back now to Croce's history as he looked back in 1950 and looking at the achievements of the Kingdom of Italy with more understanding, and in that sense, I think we share this, and so I think this paper is very important in that. I have some, in a sense, I'd like to pose some questions though, which I think might be useful for discussion, because it's one is just a historiographical question. What would Mussolini have, without the impact of Lenin? And after all, when Mussolini come to power, Lenin by this time had wiped out alternative parties in Russia, silenced some of the press. Without the impact of what the Bolsheviks had achieved in Russia, although on the opposite side in theory of a political spectrum, did the fascists have any concept of this as a model for their achievement? The other question is about whether there are analogs of fascism today. To what you talk about as different forms, or Spencer did, to what extent we can look at movements that are ugly politically, whether counter-revolutionary or racist, and assimilate them to these interwar movements, or is, as was Ernst Nolte wrote in Three Phases of Fascism, was this really an interwar, not a benevolent, not a brief parenthesis, a terrible parenthesis, but yet a movement that is created by the conditions of World War I, the Russian Revolution, and in a sense is no longer a relevant political category for us. Happily, organized communism, organized fascism, as party movements do not seem there today. But somehow it seems to me that what was behind fascism does not disappear so easily from politics. And this is where I guess I would like to hear more differentiation between the notions that the concept of totalitarianism can harbor. Totalitarian was a concept whose popularity arose. It's clear, the anti-fascists discovered it, and then Mussolini adopted it and claimed he was totalitarian himself and took pride in this, although I think he meant probably that he wanted his political movement to be the only one. And when the term was being used by the late 40s, it meant, in a sense, a permeation of all of society by political repression. And given the fact that people looked at Italy and saw there was a church, etc., this is why this concept has come under critique, because in a sense no government can satisfy the criteria of a pure totalitarianism. Perhaps briefly the Khmer Rouge or the Cultural Revolution, but we've become so finicky and demanding about fulfilling the criteria of totalitarian that it's clear, it's easy to minimize the term, and this is probably, as Emilio Gentile's paper suggests, this is a grave mistake, because the difference, I guess, is totalitarianism in practice and the coming to power, the movement, the use of violence, the contempt for political opposition, the willingness to deny it any sort of public forum, and the use of brutal methods to beat it up. So, is there a distinction to be made between totalitarianism as a path to power, in a sense, which these people recognized, and totalitarianism as a full-blown institution, as might have existed at the height of Stalinism? This I ask too because I've worked with the breakdown of the communist regimes and totalitarianism, and in the 80s, it's very hard to find a term that adequately summarizes this sort of twilight communist type of experience. The opponents of it referred to it as totalitarian, but I'm not sure by the 80s what was happening in Eastern Europe could be comprehended under this rubric. In other words, this term, I worry about its genericness. Now, this is perhaps, again, the concerns of a finicky social scientist trying to find vocabulary. It's not just that the ideas must follow the facts. It's not always facts. Some facts are clear. Other facts are constructed facts in terms of species can be clear. Genera are often constructed. And in that sense, I'd like you to reflect on that. What I find useful in thinking about this era, which opens with World War I, let us say, roughly, and then maybe or perhaps ends in Europe and North America and even South America in the late 80s, is that what you're talking about, I think, and what we sense is that the fascists and the Bolsheviks certainly were people who conceived of politics as war. It's the opposite of Clausewitz's doctrine that war was politics by other means. For these leaders, politics was war by other means. They were enemies, real enemies. Carl Schmitt enunciated this doctrine too. It was us versus them. And the use of violence, therefore, was perfectly appropriate in this war. And this is, to my mind, what defines this historical era, which was so much, formed much of the 20th century. And that, I think, is, in a certain sense, what I read in your paper, that let us recognize that with this movement, politics was war from the outset. It wasn't the only movement for which politics was war. And it's a great temptation, and it's a terrible temptation, and I do wonder whether it does not catch up with us occasionally in other ways. So if you would take your story a little further than the March on Rome and even 1923, I'd be very grateful. It was a very nice paper. That.
First of all, may I say a heartfelt thank you to the organizer of this evening's lecture, especially Professor Camuri. It's a great honor to be invited to speak in the company of scholars whose writings have been such importance for my own formation and research. I will dedicate my brief remarks to the figure referenced in Professor Gentile's lecture I know most about, which is Piero Gobetti, who was an absolute implacable opponent of the liberal state, as much as, probably more so than Salvemini. For those who don't know it, Gobetti was persecuted by the regime for his anti-fascist activities, and in the wake of the Matteotti murder was meted out a series of beatings by fascist thugs acting on Mussolini's orders. This compromised his health and led to his premature death in February of 1926 at the tender age of 24. One other reason why it's entirely appropriate to focus on that Gobetti should be a part of this symposium at the inaugural Gaetano Salvemini Colloquium is that the two, Gobetti and Salvemini, had a very, very close relationship. Gobetti regarding Salvemini as something approaching a political father figure. And I believe Salvemini thought of Gobetti as some kind of son. Let me attempt to explain why, as Professor Gentile stated in his lecture, Gobetti was one of a large number of Italian intellectuals who underestimated Mussolini when fascism came to power. Gobetti seems not to take Mussolini serious at all. He compares him to Pulcinella, the Commedia dell'arte character, and portrays him little more than a slightly newer version of Giovanni Giolitti, the only real difference being, wrote Gobetti, that Mussolini was a Romagnolo version of the Piedmontese Giolitti. He wrote in May 1923, Mussolini has learned from Giolitti and is now giving us a Romagnolo version. And what Mussolini learned from Giolitti is something that Gobetti detested, and which leads to his critique of the liberal regime, and that is trasformismo, a system and method of government based on cobbled together coalitions, compromises, deals, short-term agreements, a politics that in Gobetti's eyes at least was devoid of vision and devoid of ethics. The line of continuity that Gobetti traces leading from Giolitti's liberal Italy to Mussolini's fascist one is one of the reasons behind what is probably Gobetti's most famous remark when he writes that fascism was Italy's autobiography. It was an accident waiting to happen, he says. Behind Gobetti's treatment of Mussolini are a series of factors. First, he was still very young, in his early 20s when Mussolini came to power. Second, he was a journalist with a penchant for the catchy phrase, like the one above, and was always taken by the possibility of a pithy expression or epithet that would have the greatest effect, and something that would get him into trouble on occasion. But it also deprives his thought of some of its sophistication. And third, but most important, and perhaps most surprisingly, is Gobetti's conviction that Mussolini was a pacifier, a man of compromise, or to use the term Gobetti himself uses in Italian, an addomesticatore, a domatore is another expression that he uses. In other words, for Gobetti, Mussolini is little more than the next trasformista in line, following on the Giolittian tradition. If trasformismo or trasformista are terms that are part of the Giolitti lexicon, the term that probably has the highest profile in Gobetti's own and in the lexicon used to talk about him is intransigent, to mean someone who sticks to his or her guns, does not brook compromise, who does not delight his or her views for short-term gain. To be intransigent is to be everything a trasformista is not. Gobetti was intransigent. Mussolini, Gobetti thought, was a trasformista. The answer to the question as to why Gobetti thought compromise such a bad thing lies in his belief that change, progress, history all come out of struggle. They are created from the sparks that are given off when two opposites collide at full belt, two generations colliding, two ideologies, two antagonists. Progress, history, and change come not out of compromise or death strategy. They come when one side emerges victorious, the other defeated. Progress, history, and change are the result for Gobetti of a fight. But it takes two to fight. And you can't, thought Gobetti, fight with the trasformista. You can have a negotiation, you can cut a deal, but not have a fight. For Gobetti's antagonistic theory of change, which he got from one of his other mentors, Luigi Einaudi, who said the idea is born of contrast, the fight has to be fair, two opposites facing up to each other fairly and squarely, maintaining their positions, arguing for them as coherently as they can, and in good faith, may the best idea win. This was not possible with Mussolini, and is why Gobetti makes disparaging remarks about him. Surprisingly, though, Gobetti did see some fascists with whom such a fight between intransigent opposites might have been possible. If it's certainly the case that Gobetti sees no totalitarian vocation in Mussolini when he came to power, although by April 1924 he was using Amendola's language to speak about Mussolini's totalitarian systems, it's also the case that Gobetti identified right from fascism's early days within the National Fascist Party a kind of fascism, a strain of fascism that was qualitatively different from Mussolini's. This was a fascism that was harsher, nastier, but from Gobetti's perspective, more intransigent, and for which he had, and I have to be careful how I put this, far more respect, but always tempered respect, than he had for Mussolini. This, of course, was the fascism of the first hour, the kind of fascism that was represented by hardliners like Bianchi, who Professor Gentile mentioned, but above all, in Gobetti's eyes, by Roberto Farinacci, and a kind of fascism whose radicalism, this was a kind of fascism whose radicalism and novelty, I would say, Gobetti was well aware of. In fact, just as he identified two anti-fascisms, a soft and a hard one, he also saw two fascisms, Mussolini's and Farinacci's. And odd as it may seem for a convinced anti-fascist like Gobetti, it was the Farinacci variant that he hoped would get the upper hand. In fact, in October 1923, he wrote an article using the ironic vein he often adopted, entitled, strangely enough, In Praise of Farinacci. Farinacci was a particularly nasty character, by the way. Collaborated with the Nazis when after September 1943. What Gobetti wanted was for fascism to show what he considered its real face, with the reassuring Mussolini mask ripped off, revealing the likes of Farinacci and Bianchi. To have such a fascism on view would make for a clearer, simpler battlefield, pitting two intransigences, one against the other. If he had something close to a sneaking admiration for Farinacci, it was certainly not for his fascism, but for his intransigence. Despising him ideologically, Gobetti did, though, recognize his coherence, or what he interpreted as such, within the confines of an interpretive frame in which the hegemonic presence is that of Mussolini, the trasformista. Farinacci's fascism, Gobetti was to write, was of a kind that troubled fainter spirits who had been attracted to fascism through Mussolini. For such people, Gobetti wrote, Farinacci's fascism has for such people, Farinacci's fascism has a serious defect. It is too intransigent, too serious. It forces you to believe in a political faction and to take responsibility for that belief. And of those like Farinacci, who Gobetti writes in the same article, although they defend illegitimate personal positions, i.e. cannot possibly in agreement with them, it is important to recognize that those positions have been acquired with sacrifice and muscles. As such, he concludes, we must respect a sense of dignity and a proof of sacrifice. Gobetti, in fact, hoped that the fascism that was to emerge from the 1924 elections would be Farinacci-style fascism. It's such, he thought, it may have had a salutary effect upon Italy and Italians, insofar as it would shake them from their complacency, awake them from their slumbers. When fascism came to power, he wrote in November 1922, fascism, and he wrote this in November 1922, fascism could have administered a sharp dose of tyranny for those who had only read about it in books. It would have been a reality check. The fascism that would be useful, he wrote in his article, praising Farinacci, was the fascism of the Manganello. This line of thinking comes to a head in one of Gobetti's best and most well-known articles, in praise of the guillotine. So in praise of Farinacci, now we have in praise of the guillotine. The one in which the comment about fascism as Italy's autobiography appears. This was published in November 1922. Let me just read a longish bit. He says, "Let's be frank. I waited anxiously for personal persecutions to come about, so that from our suffering a spirit could be reborn, so that out of the sacrifice of priests this people could recognize itself. And we have to hope, with a great deal of skepticism, alas, that tyrants will be tyrants, that reaction is reaction, that there are those who will have the courage to raise the guillotine, and that positions will be defended to the end. We can benefit from the fascist regime, make it yield all its fruits. We demand a whiplashing that will wake people up. We demand the hangman so that we can see clearly." In effect, then, Gobetti plays off an intransigent fascism that he has some time for, on account of its intransigence rather than its fascism, I have to repeat, against the transformist fashion in the image of Giolitti, for which he has no time at all. He wants to use intransigent fascism as a lever with which to bring pressure on those Italians among his readership who have not yet seen what fascism actually is. To adapt the expression Gobetti used when talking of the role played by myth in the stoking of political of action, the intransigent fashion that he stars in the pages of his articles will, he hopes, be a spur to action. Underlying all this, there is a rhetorical ploy, overstating one's case for effect, exaggeration, hyperbole. Gobetti's many writings are meant to persuade, to rally like-thinking young men and women into anti-fascist action. His then is a rhetoric of persuasion. But a side effect of such rhetoric is that the opposites with which he works gets pushed to the extremes, as figures, Mussolini and Farinacci, and as stances, intransigent and trasformismo. These figures are co-opted, as it were, into playing roles in Gobetti's project. So needing two extremes, two stark opposites, in order forcefully to play the one off against the other, the transformist and the bastion of intransigence become, respectively, more transformist and more intransigent than they may actually have been. First and foremost, I would suggest that the Mussolini and Farinacci we find in Gobetti's writings are playing roles that Gobetti, rather than history, has assigned them. We get some hint of this, I think, in the rather showy, over-the-top, deliberately provocative way Gobetti writes of such men. The tragic irony, though, is that, but treating in this way real-life figures, both of whom come with heavy baggage of their own, as part of a strategy to persuade readers that action is necessary, is something of a dangerous game, one that is prey to pitfalls and incomprehension. The tragic irony, though, is that it was a combination of the two fascisms working in concert, not that they were separated, that brought Gobetti to his death. On the part of Mussolini, a handwritten telegram dated June the 1st, 1924 to the Turin prefect with the order to make life difficult for this foolish opponent of the government and fascism, questo insulso oppositore governo e fascismo. Mussolini's order was passed on to some diehards, the Farinacci kind, who did exactly what they had been told, beating him up for a first time outside his house on the morning of June the 9th, beating him up again much more violently in September of that year, and once again in September of the following year, seriously weakening Gobetti's heart. A few months later, in exile in Paris, his brief life came to an end. Thank you.
I will give Emilio, if you wish to respond, and then a very brief moment for questions from the audience, because we are running late, and as we're talking about political contention, we have an example of it later in our own culture in a different way at 9 o'clock, and people will want to get to it. So, Emilio, please. Yes.
I have read perhaps only a quarter of the original paper, and so a lot of things have been missed. But now the questions that have been asked or comments require at least 3 years of lecturing.
We can't give you that
I
tonight.
thank you. I
know.
thank you very much for what you have said, for what you agree, mainly for what you disagree, because I am Gobettiano in this sense. Disagreement make you thinking. Disagreement. That's why Gobetti wanted to have a totalitarian fascism, so that you have a total freedom. Compromise means that you left something incomplete. And well, but I think the most important question from Charles Mayer, first of all, yes, Salvemini, I've cut off because of time, not because I want to defend Salvemini. I sided with Salvemini because he was an honest historian, because he hated liberal democracy. He hated Giolitti. He compared Giolitti to Mussolini and said Mussolini is Giolitti with the armed party. But it's a big difference anyway, to have an armed party. It's a novelty. But it's interesting that here in Harvard, lecturing on fascism, Salvemini was polemizing against the way fascism was diminishing, disparaging the liberal Italy. Build up a new positive image of what Italy has achieved from 1816 to 1922. But there is another, a most forgotten essay of Salvemini, which was before Benedetto Croce's History of Italy. In 1925, he wrote a very short essay, Political Italy from the Risorgimento to 1914. It is an apology of a liberal Italy. He's defined the Risorgimento. As a politician, he criticized the Risorgimento, but it's a cyclopic opera, a gigantic enterprise. And then he said, what Italy have achieved in 15 years of freedom is a miracle in European history. So, as a politician, he was sometimes very blind to some reality, as in Giolitti, as in Mussolini. But as a historian, he was honest enough to go beyond his personal opinions. And that's why I think that Salvemini can teach something to historians who are so stick to their ideas that they don't change, not even if facts are demonstrated the contrary. In this case, I go to this important question by Charles Mayer. I don't think there is any connection between Gulag and Auschwitz. There is no connection between the Leninism as a model of totalitarianism and fascism. In Italy, when the fascists took power, in the way we have seen, not in the way we imagine, the dictator started after the March on Rome, the image of Russia in the fascist press was a crumbling regime. Lenin was ill. There is a fight between the different members. And the fascists also remembered that Zinoviev and Kamenev were against the Bolshevik revolution, the coup d'etat. So there is no idea that Bolshevism is a model. What the anti-fascists define as totalitarian with something very original, which came out of the existence of an armed party. And the Bolshevik was not an armed party. It's a party of intellectuals. The other aspect is that Mussolini just say, well, we are like the communists against the liberalism. It's the only model they have, that Mussolini extolled. To say we are new, because liberalism is old. It was the system, the ideology, the faith of the 19th century. Today, all this myth doesn't exist anymore. The new revolution are communism and fascism, and this is a speech of 1923. But fascism, but Mussolini and fascists never took the Russian model as a kind of lecturing on totalitarianism. It was these anti-fascists, Amendola, Sturzo, who first made a comparison saying, well, we are now confronting two new type of political regime based on the single party rule. This is the most simple definition of the original meaning of totalitarianism. That's why I think that this concept, which was the consequence of Hannah Arendt, of Friedrich Brzezinski, of this modelistic theory of totalitarianism, is a kind of a full-fledged. I don't see any political system full-fledged, full-blown. when the United States is a full-fledged democracy, or Great Britain, I think that in history nothing is full-fledged. But we have always experiment. That's why I think that the best use of the concept of totalitarianism is that it's an experiment, not a goal. It's a method, not a myth. It's the way you want to impose the rule of a single group all over the society. And the idea of a molding population came later. That's why I think that using the concept in its original meaning, you describe a new political system which was not theorized before. Not Mussolini, not Lenin theorized the single party system. It was a consequence of politics as war. This was typical, not only of the consequence of the First World War, or the concept of a revolution as a civil war. It was a consequence of the idea of the development of the myth of violence and the practice of violence in 19th century. So I think there is a kind of tradition, anti-liberal, anti-democratic, always thinking of politics as a permanent war, until the good triumph on the evil. And this is the aspect, I think. I don't believe that fascism can survive, but this tendency, I put simply, democracy is always fragile. Because in democracy, there always arises a new group which want to abolish this conflict and impose one rule. We have politics as culture. We have in American literature the cultural war. This idea that relativism, the essence of liberalism, is a danger for the unity of society. And this is racism, xenophobia, always the idea that when you have conflicts, and democracy is permanent conflicts, you are in danger, you put the unity of the state, of the society, of the nation, of the race in danger. And I think that this is why, this is the roots of these different thinkings that led to the same organization of the political method, of political system, which is the single party regime. And I think that when I confront history in the two war periods, of course, I see that everybody loving freedom, but all religious people. The first conference of the totalitarian state actually was held not in Philadelphia, but in Oxford, by the ecumenical movement, published 6 volumes. Why these Christians were so scared? They do not think about the fantasy, that model, full-fledged, the reality of a political system which usurped the role of the religion, imposed something which is called the sacralization. 6 volumes to describe this phenomenon. And then looking at the reality, not the intention, to the ideology. I think that the mistake of the theory of totalitarianism during the Cold War was, of course, it was used as a weapon against the communists identified with Nazism. But also this mania to build up a theory of totalitarianism which was really not the result of history, but the result of George Orwell, Big Brother. So I think we have, but my slogan is, let's return to history, and to see this concept, how it developed, and the weakness when it is used to define something which has most to do with the ideal type, instead of the reality. But I do not accept the idea that you can banish it anymore. Every concept is weak if compared to reality. Any full-fledged ideal type is the weakness. But why is only totalitarianism has been the target of such, you know, that in 1968, the entry, Totalitarianism, International Encyclopedia of Social Science, ended by Spiro, if I can remember, said, we hope that in the next edition, there will be no entry on totalitarianism as there wasn't in the first edition, 1928. Well, in the new edition of the International Encyclopedia of Social Science, there is no entry on totalitarianism. I think this is kind of mutilating history, because when people reads Aron, reads Paul Tillich, reads historians, read sociologists, reads theology, in the interwar periods, was reflecting on totalitarianism, say, oh, these people are like Peter Pan, really. They are all darling family. I want to see what is the reality that we are trying to reflect through this concept. And free the concept from all this full-fledged construction, which I think can destroy any concept which is in historical reality. because historical reality is by its nature imperfect, unfull-fledged, unblown, and so on. And I think that the movements, yes, I think that fascism is impossible, totalitarianism is impossible. Single-party system is something of the past, as it was the party of the notabili. But this tendency to see democracy as a permanent threat, to see the fragility of democracy, something that you have to overcome, because conflict is always dangerous, to want homogeneity, but homogeneity through the imposing one culture, one politics, one ideology on the others. I think this is a permanent threat in all full-fledged democracy. Democracy, by its nature, is weak. But to destroy democracy, it's not a structure that decided, are men. It was not a liberal state that was weak, because when the fascists decided to took power, the liberal state had no men deciding to oppose. Giolitti did that with D'Annunzio, but Mussolini was clever enough to take Giolitti out. But otherwise, I'm sure that if Giolitti went to power in 1922, even if he was 80 years old, he would have blocked the fascists. So structure, autobiography of the nation, beautiful interpretation, but the real meaning of history, who decided to act, who decided not to act. And we go to the experience, concrete experience. Perhaps this is the prejudice of an historian. I'm sorry for that.
I think this eloquent elaboration of your paper, which is really part of the paper in many ways, is probably the place we should close. We will be upstairs. There are questions, but we've been tremendously, I think, privileged and forced to think this evening in many different levels and about an event which I'm glad still compels so much attention and doesn't get stares, unknowing stares from the people here happily. And I want to thank the Consul for having made this event possible, and his interest in Italian studies at Harvard, Renato, who conceived of it, David for that thoughtful comment on Gobetti, which revealed a great deal to me, and Spencer DeScala, who's always been very industrious in bringing Italian history to the Boston area, and you, sir, for having come here. And this has been it has been a commemoration in the appropriate sense of what politics is about, and so I'm happy and thankful, and let us we can go upstairs and have some refreshments and continue a conversation if we wish.